Here we are, it's Good Friday. It's only been a few short hours since Jesus' Last Supper with his disciples in a safe and secure place. Much has taken place, though. Jesus has been betrayed, arrested, unjustly run through a series of kangaroo courts, been denied by his strongest ally, whipped and tortured, sentenced to death, cruelly killed by crucifixion, and finally buried. The hangnail that I was complaining about this morning isn't quite such a big problem in comparison, I would guess. When I've said before that Jesus knows your pain experienced physically as well as emotionally, I think this proves that he knows what you're going through. It's okay to lean on him when you're in pain, even if it's as minuscule as my hangnail. Regardless of how it compares to others, he will listen. He guarantees it. Again, to continue using the concept of comparing this last week of Jesus' life to a big roller coaster ride, today on Good Friday we are plunging down the descent. Remember in last Sunday, that's Palm Sunday's story, which was only a scant 5 days ago when Jesus was entering Jerusalem in a fanfare of palm waving and shouts of hallelujah. This was like the start of the ride in my example, when the roller coaster train is being pulled up the ramp until it almost reaches the highest elevation of the ride. Maundy, Thursday, yesterday was like when the cars balance on the apex of the ride for just a second. Everyone knows something's going to happen, but no one knows for sure. The air is filled with tense apprehension and anxiety. And then today, Good Friday, is like when all the cars finally clear the chain drive and we begin that nosedive into terror. When I first offered this analogy, I admitted that I was very frightened on this dive. I swore that our car had physically lifted off the tracks and we were in free fall. As we continued to fall faster and faster, I noticed that words were coming out of my mouth that I would not normally say, and the tone of my voice was more than a high-pitched scream. That always present summer smell of suntan lotion, cotton candy, and fried food evidently disappeared. I think because my brain stopped paying attention to the smells in this panic. We were plummeting out of control. Everybody was wanting to get off right now, and we were regretting that we had made the poor decision to get on the ride in the first place. But there was nothing we could do. We were tightly held in place by the massive shoulder restraints, and the only option that we had was to try to maintain self-control and ride out the ride. As I've mentioned before, this is almost the same situation that the disciples faced on that eventful Friday over 2,000 years ago. The events leading up to the death of Jesus had been a whirlwind of insane events. Like the coaster ride, events out of the disciples' control were bashing them from side to side and up and down seemingly without warning or logical progression, until 11 of them effectively hunkered down and hid for fear of their own lives. Their ride was proving to be more than they expected. And isn't that where we are today? Like the disciples, we are sequestered, not wanting to set foot outside the house unless we have to. We don't like the ride, but there are no alternatives. We continue to drift and glide and float along wherever the major events carry us, because very large forces are in motion, and it will probably be some time before things calm down again. But today, as we ride on this giant roller coaster ride called coronavirus, it seems that we are riding on maybe a little bit more slowly, maybe not all that much slower, but it doesn't seem as fast as it did in the initial plunge. And the hills, well, they're not quite as high, and the corners don't slam you from side to side as with the insane intensity as they did in the beginning. Things seem to be letting off, at least a bit. That's not to say that there's not going to be more ride excitement later on. I remember a roller coaster ride I was on years ago when I figured the ride was mostly over and we were coming to an end. But all of a sudden we dove down into a tree-lined tunnel entrance that went underground. That unexpected surprise almost caused me to lose more than verbal self-control. It occurred right at the end of the ride, but even then that extreme and unforeseen shock makes it the most memorable roller coaster event I can recall. I hope my attempt at humorously comparing Christ's last days to a roller coaster ride is not mocking or disrespectful. What happened today, and to whom it happens, makes for a solemn and mournful day. Every year this day of darkness and remorse comes around, I have a deeper and deeper sense of regret, and also a deeper sense of appreciation for what Jesus went through for me. I know I cannot fully repay my debt to him for his gift of sacrifice, but I do believe that I can make installments on that obligation by working to follow the last commandment that Jesus imparted upon us from John 13:34. And he says, "So now I am giving you a new commandment. Love each other just as I have loved you, so you should love one another." It's the toughest commandment issued by Jesus, in my opinion. The best way to understand this epic journey of Christ's last days is to once again listen to the narrative created by John in chapters 18 and 19, and this will make up pretty much the remainder of my message this evening. This is from the New Living Testament. Jesus is betrayed and arrested. After saying these things, Jesus crossed the Kidron Valley with his disciples and entered a grove of olive trees. Judas the betrayer knew this place because Jesus had gone often there with his disciples. The leading priests and Pharisees had given Judas a contingent of Roman soldiers and temple guards to accompany him. Now with blazing torches, lanterns, and weapons, they arrived at the olive grove. Jesus fully realized what was going to happen to him, so he stepped forward to meet them. "Who are you looking for?" he asked. "Jesus the Nazarene," they replied. "I am he," Jesus said. Judas, who betrayed him, was standing with them. As Jesus said, "I am he," they all drew back and fell to the ground. And once more he asked them, "Who are you looking for?" And again they replied, "Jesus the Nazarene." "I told you that I am he," Jesus said, "and since I am the one you want, let these others go." He did this to fulfill his own statement, "I did not lose a single one of those you gave me." Then Simon Peter drew a sword and slashed off the right ear of Malchus, the high priest's slave. But Jesus said to Peter, "Put back your sword into its sheath. Shall I not drink from this cup of suffering the Father has given me?" Jesus at the high priest's house. So the soldiers, their commanding officer, and the temple guards arrested Jesus and tied him up. First they took him to Annas, since he was the father-in-law of Caiaphas, the high priest at the time. Caiaphas was the one who had told the other Jewish leaders, "It's better that one man should die for the people." Peter's first denial. Simon Peter followed Jesus, as did another of the disciples. That other disciple was acquainted with the high priest, so he was allowed to enter the high priest's courtyard with Jesus. Peter had to stay outside the gate. Then the disciple who knew the high priest spoke to the woman watching the gate, and she let Peter in. The woman asked Peter, "You're not one of this man's disciples, are you?" "No," he said, "I am not." Because it was cold, the household servants and guards had made a charcoal fire, and they stood around it, warming themselves, and Peter stood with them, warming himself. The high priest questions Jesus. Inside, the high priest began asking Jesus about his followers and what he had been teaching them. Jesus replied, "Everyone knows what I teach. I have preached regularly in the synagogues and the temple, where the people gather. I have not spoken in secret. Why are you asking me this question? Ask those who heard me. They know what I said." One of the temple guards standing nearby slapped Jesus across the face. "Is that the way to answer the high priest?" he demanded. And Jesus replied, "If I said anything wrong, you must prove it. But if I'm speaking the truth, why are you beating me?" Then Annas bound Jesus and sent him to Caiaphas, the high priest. Peter's second and third denials. Meanwhile, as Simon Peter was standing by the fire warming himself, they asked him again, You're not one of his disciples, are you?" He denied it, saying, "No, I am not." But one of the household slaves of the high priest, a relative of the man whose ear Peter had cut off, asked, "Didn't I see you out there in the olive grove with Jesus?" And again Peter denied it. And immediately a rooster crowed. Jesus' trial before Pilate. Jesus' trial in front of Caiaphas ended in the early hours of the morning. Then he was taken to the headquarters of the Roman governor. His accusers didn't go inside because it would defile them, and they wouldn't be able to celebrate the Passover. So Pilate, the governor, went out to them and asked, "What is your charge against this man?" "We wouldn't have handed him over to you if he weren't a criminal," they retorted. "Then take him away and judge him by our own law," Pilate told them. "Only the Romans are permitted to execute someone," the Jewish leaders replied. And this fulfilled Jesus' prediction about the way he would die. Then Pilate went back into his headquarters and called for Jesus to be brought to him. "Are you the king of the Jews?" he asked him. Jesus replied, "Is this your own question, or did the others tell you about me?" "Am I a Jew?" Pilate retorted. "Your own people and their leading priests brought you to me for a trial. Why, what have you done?" Jesus answered, "My kingdom is not an earthly kingdom. If it were, my followers would fight to keep me from being handed over to the Jewish leaders. But my kingdom is not of this world." Pilate said, "So you are a king?" And Jesus responded, "You say I am a king. Actually, I was born and came into the world to testify to the truth. All who love the truth and recognize that what I say is true." "What is truth?" Pilate asked. Then he went out again to the people and told them, "He is not guilty of any crime, but you have a custom of asking me to release one prisoner each year at Passover. Would you like me to release this king of the Jews?" But they shouted back, "No, not this man. We want Barabbas." Barabbas was a revolutionary. Jesus is sentenced to death. Then Pilate had Jesus flogged with a lead-tipped whip. The soldiers wove a crown of thorns and put it on his head, and they put a purple robe upon him. "Hail, King of the Jews!" they mocked as they slapped him across the face. Pilate went outside again and said to the people, "I am going to bring him out to you now, but understand clearly that I find him not guilty." Then Jesus came out wearing the crown of thorns and the purple robe, and Pilate said, "Look, here is the man." When they saw him, the leading priests and temple guards began shouting, "Crucify him! Crucify him!" "Take him yourselves and crucify him," Pilate said. "I find him not guilty." And the Jewish leaders replied, "By our law he ought to die because he called himself the Son of God." When Pilate heard this, he was more frightened than ever. He took Jesus back into his headquarters again and asked him, "Where are you from?" But Jesus gave no answer. "Why won't you talk to me?" Pilate demanded. "Don't you realize that I have the power to release you or crucify you?" Then Jesus said, "You would have no power over me at all unless it were given to you from above. So the one who handed me over to you has the greater sin." Then Pilate tried to release him, but the Jewish leaders shouted, "If you release this man, you are no friend of Caesar. Anyone who declares himself a king is a rebel against Caesar." When they said this, Pilate brought Jesus out to them again. Then Pilate sat down on the judgment seat on the platform that is called the stone pavement, in Hebrew, Gabbatha. It was now about noon on the day of preparation for the Passover. And Pilate said to the people, "Look, here is your king." "Away with him," they yelled. "Away with him! Crucify him!" "What? Crucify your king?" Pilate asked. "We have no king but Caesar," the leading priests shouted back. Then Pilate turned Jesus over to them to be crucified. The crucifixion. So they took Jesus away. Carrying the cross by himself, he went to the place called the Place of the Skull, in Hebrew, Golgotha. There they nailed him to the cross. 2 others were crucified with him, one on either side, with Jesus in between them. And Pilate posted a sign on the cross that read, "Jesus of Nazareth, the King of the Jews." place where Jesus was crucified was near the city, and the sign was written in Hebrew, in Latin, and Greek, so that many people could read it. Then the leading priests objected and said to Pilate, "Change it from the King of Jews to, 'He said, I am the King of the Jews.'" Pilate replied, "No, what I have written, I have written." When the soldiers had crucified Jesus, they divided his clothing among the 4 of them. They also took his robe, but it was seamless, woven in one piece from top to bottom. So they said, "Rather than tear it apart, let's throw dice for it." This fulfilled the scripture that said, "They divided my garments among themselves and threw dice for my clothing." So that is what they did. Standing near the cross were Jesus' mother and his sister Mary, the wife of Clopas, and Mary Magdalene were. When Jesus saw his mother standing there beside the disciple he loved, he said to her, "Dear woman, here is your son." And he said to this disciple, "Here is your mother." And from then on, this disciple took her into his home. The death of Jesus. Jesus knew that his mission was now finished, and to fulfill Scripture, he said, "I am thirsty." A jar of sour wine was sitting there, so they soaked a sponge in it, put it on a hyssop branch, and held it up to his lips. When Jesus had tasted it, he said, "It is finished." And he bowed his head and gave up his spirit. It was the day of preparation, and the Jewish leaders didn't want the bodies hanging there the next day, which was the Sabbath, and a very special Sabbath because it was Passover week. So they asked Pilate to hasten their deaths by ordering that their legs be broken and their bodies could be taken down. So the soldiers came and broke the legs of the 2 men crucified with Jesus. But when they came to Jesus, they saw that he was already dead, so they didn't break his legs. One of the soldiers, however, pierced his side with a spear, and immediately blood and water flowed out. This report is from an eyewitness giving an accurate account. He speaks the truth so that you may continue to believe. These things happened in fulfillment of the scriptures that say, "Not one of his bones will be broken, and they will look upon the one they pierced." The burial of Jesus. Afterward, Joseph of Arimathea, who had been a secret disciple of Jesus because he feared the Jewish leaders, asked Pilate for permission to take down Jesus' body. When Pilate gave permission, Joseph came and took the body away. With him came Nicodemus, the man who had come to Jesus at night. He brought about 75 pounds of perfumed ointment made from myrrh and aloes. And following the burial custom, they wrapped Jesus' body with the spices in long sheets of linen cloth. The place of crucifixion was near a garden where there was a new tomb that had never been used before. And so, because it was the day of preparation for the Jewish Passover, and since the tomb was close at hand, they laid Jesus there. This ends the reading of the Gospel. May God add his blessing to the reading of his word. Back to the message, walking on a path that is closer to God won't lessen the ups and downs and the curves of the ride that we get in life, but having the faith and commitment that comes with being in a familiar relationship with God will make the ride not only more bearable, but also much more enjoyable. And remember, everything that happens here on earth, both good and bad, will eventually all work to the glory of God. So if you're worried or depressed after today's dark events, take heart, because coming up is an unexpected twist that is about to embroil you in the best news ever.